I'm Chaplain Sanders, and I'm going to talk about the 3 spheres of war. Now, as leaders in a combat organization, we have a professional obligation for the ethical application of force. That means that it's effective, that it's efficient, and it doesn't do more death and destruction than absolutely is necessary to achieve the end game that we're after. Now, studying war is complex. It's chaotic. There's a lot happening. If you start looking at the level of complexity that's actually happening in war, it's pretty profound. And we're not the first people to ever wrestle with this, to really try to understand what war looks like and what war is. There's a guy back in the the early part of last century named J.F.C. Fuller who decided he was going to study war and try to really kind of distill it down into some actionable tenets and some principles that he could pass on to the next generation. And when he sat down at his desk and he started looking over a bunch of books, he started to understand that everybody is just this in this big crowded room, and they're all just talking all this noise and stuff. There's some guys that are yelling about logistics, and some people about tactics, weapons, all this political stuff. And he was like, there needs to be some sort of organizational system that helps us understand what is actually going on. And so he goes over to his bookshelf, he pulls off a book on philosophy, dusts off the dust, and starts reading and starts building what in theology you would call a systematic theology, or a framework to really understand a very big and complex idea. And out of that came out the J.F.C. Fuller's 3 spheres of war. Now those 3 spheres of war are broke down like this. There's a physical plane of war where there's an actual, philosophers would call it empiricism. There's an interaction with the actual world that starts sending us data in. There's a mental plane of war to where we take that data and we start to try to make sense of it and organize it in such a way that it's efficient and it's effective to use for decision making. And lastly, there is a moral plane of war, the part where your soul starts to assign meaning, to where with the physical plane, somebody's shooting at me and I understand that that's what's happening, and then I start to say okay, well, shooting at me means that if you hit me in the face, I'm going to die. And then the moral plane of war, the soul engaging part of that is that if I die, I never get to see my kids again. And so those are the 3 planes of war that Fuller would actually come to know and use based on what he called the threefold nature of man. Now, that seems like a lot, but it's actually a pretty common construct that you're used to working with every single day. If you think about your phone, all right, your phone has a physical sphere that it operates in, a physical plane. There's an actual piece of glass and some microchips and a case and all these things that you can actually touch and interact with. And as that phone starts to take in all this data from the outside world, it starts to synthesize it with an operating system. Maybe you have iOS, like I do, that they can take all of this information, form it into lines of code, and organize it in such a way that's actually actionable, something that you can actually use and do something with. But then there's apps on that phone that takes that data, that turns around and says hey, look, this means that your wife is calling you. That this means that this is a picture that I'm going to show you, and that your soul can interact with and say man, that's my kid and I really, really miss him. Now, that is J.C. Fuller's 3 planes of war that's really just right there in your hand in a very real and visceral way that you can see and understand. So what does that mean for the maneuverist? What does that mean for somebody that's engaging in combat? Well, history has a lot of really good examples of that. One of them, which is Norman Schwarzkopf in the Gulf War. Schwarzkopf knew that in order to achieve defeat over the Iraqi army, he had to engage effectively in all 3 spheres that Fuller talked about. So what does he do? First, on the physical plane, Fuller, and we'll get into this in later videos, will say that that morale is basically leveraged from the physical combat power that actually shows up. So Schwarzkopf knew that he had to have more and better trained people showing up there in the desert ready to fight the Iraqi army. He had to overmatch the Iraqi army, and he did. He showed up with one of the biggest armored armies the world has ever seen, and probably ever will see now that we see the way the warfare is progressing. The next, he started to outthink his enemy. He started to engage in that mental plane. It's like, here's all the stuff, there's all their stuff. Now how do I outthink and actually think through what's the best way to do it? So he engaged in some deception operations, and he did the big swinging hook with Third ID out in the Saudi Arabian desert to come in behind the Iraqi army, who was arrayed closer down to the port of Kuwait, knowing that this was the engagement in the mental plane that he did. But lastly, and probably the most effectively, he engaged in the moral plane of war by putting in stealth bombers into Baghdad, by cutting off their lines of communication, by disrupting their supply lines, by having SF teams cause all kinds of racket behind their lines to make them think that, like, what's going on behind me? I'm seeing all these guys here, are they behind me? And also now they start to try to take all this data in, and their souls start to assign meaning there. That means that if they're behind me, they're in front of me, I'm surrounded, I don't get to go home to see my kids at night. I'm never going to return to the farms that I was conscripted off of. That, like, all of a sudden now there's a moral breakdown, and that is a maneuverist is what we're after. That is defeat. That makes that like we don't have to contest our wills against the enemy whenever their will just goes out the window and they don't want to fight anymore. And that is the ethical goal that we're fighting for, to try to get to the most efficient use of combat power, to create defeat in our enemies so that way they just simply give up. So looking forward, we're going to have 3 more videos. One, we're going to talk about the physical plane of war and what does that look like, and how did Fuller analyze that, and how can we use that analysis in our day-to-day life, or our military life. The next one, we're going to talk about the mental plane of war. What does it mean to outthink our enemy, and how did Fuller engage in that, and how can we take those lessons and those principles and put them into the way that we structure our training plans and structure the way that we think about things and how we fight. And then lastly, and probably most importantly, we're going to talk about engaging the enemy on those moral planes of war, and how do we create defeat in their hearts and minds so that way we can win in the most effective and efficiently possible, the way that we as leaders are called to do. Thank you very much, and hunt, race, kill.